Right, so we're live for this morning's e-memoir session in association with eSpirals, and this morning we're looking at managing effective learning support for apprentices. And as ever, we like to keep these sessions interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. And today we're joined by Beej Kaczmarczyk, Carol Smith and Holly Newton. I'll allow everybody else to do some correct introductions as we get going as well. Without further ado, I'm going to mute my microphone and hand over to Beej. Thanks, Beej.
Thanks very much, then, Marek, and good morning to everyone, and hope everyone's keeping well. As Marek says, for those of you maybe not familiar with our webinars, this webinar will be recorded, and so after today, you'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording. So don't worry about if you're keeping notes or whatever, that you don't have to worry about catching up. You can obviously review the webinar, the recording and the slides with your team after today. And for those of you that are not able to attend the live webinar, then obviously if there's any questions that have been posed in the course of today that you would not have posed and you've got some additional questions, then our contact details, that's for myself, for Carol and Holly, are available at the end. For those that don't know me, my name is Beej Kaczmarczyk. I'm semi-retired. Had a long record of working in the post-16 sector in England, but also done short projects in Scotland, Wales, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and through colleagues also in the Balkan states. And my background also extends to being a governor of a college, as well as the chair of the board of one of the largest independent training providers. My interest in learning support started way back in the school sector, where I was as a deputy head teacher, and then in 1993, as we prepared for incorporation, very much involved in sorting out the funding and advising on the funding of learning support in the post-16 sector. Carol, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Hi there, yes, I'm Carol Smith. So I've worked within the apprenticeship sector for longer than I care to mention, but I have worked with Train to Gain before that. So I've been working with work-based learning for a lot of years and worked in several colleges at sort of senior leadership level. I've always been interested in learning support for apprenticeships. I think the work-based learning sector does do learning support for apprenticeships very well. I think what we're not so good at is actually making those claims. So I'm really interested to work with Beej on this particular project. And I've been working now with VLE support with eSpirals since November.
Thanks very much, Carol. Holly?
Yeah, I'm Holly, and I've been with some MIDA systems producing eSpirals and before that Spiral since 2011. So, through lots of changes in learning support and keeping up with the kind of funding guidance and developing the product so that it suits the needs of colleges and also training providers in terms of recording that for apprentices. So I look forward to showing you a little bit about eSpirals at the end.
That's great. Thanks very much, then. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Holly. The theme, I suppose, is critical, and that's really starting off with what do we mean by learning support in the context of work-based learning and apprenticeships. And I think for apprentices, this has been a focus of government attention and other agencies' attention, certainly from the days of FEFC, the Learning and Skills Council, the Skills Funding Agency, and now, of course, the Education and Skills Funding Agency. And it's been it's not always had the prominence with apprentices that maybe it has had with 16 to 18-year-olds in full-time education or those within the school environment. But I think it's very important to recognise there is a policy background to this. There have been quite a lot of studies or reviews, certainly over the last 15 years, that's been looking at learning support in those different sort of post-16 contexts, and in some cases very much focusing on what was happening in work-based learning, what was happening in the apprenticeship world. And I think there's still, despite the work of Peter Little, 2012, looking at what was happening in terms of the participation of learners with learning difficulties and or disabilities in apprenticeships, and the figures that showed some decline. It recommended, and this was obviously not the first report, it was the second report, had actually recommended that we increase the funding to make sure that we remove some of the barriers to access to help the recruitment of particularly of younger apprentices, the 19 to 24-year-old apprentices, and that would give both providers and employers the confidence to recruit and improve participation of those learners in apprenticeships, and then ongoing support and obviously completion and achievement of their apprenticeship programs. And I think it's very important to remember that that review acknowledged that for many apprentices with learning support needs, and those were very much about a whole range of individual needs, that they would perhaps need not only the additional resource, the additional support from staff, but also in some cases longer to complete their apprenticeships. I think the work of Paul Maynard, who led a task force that was commissioned by the Minister for Disabled People at that time and the Minister for Skills, was very much a sort of, if you want, a task force of parliamentarians looking at, with obviously advice and guidance, they were looking a little bit further than the work of Peter Little and saying that, you know, a whole lot of different agencies need to come together. So not only the funding agency, but DWP, etc. And to look at those barriers that were difficult for apprentices with individual learning needs and or disabilities to actually access the apprenticeship offer, to be retained on the offer, and to complete their apprenticeship. And so this was very much about work that would look at different practical recommendations that would improve retention achievement, as well as remove some of those barriers. And I think that started to look at the different stages from pre-entry to obviously completion of the apprenticeship in terms of practical ways in which providers and their employer partners could work with the individual apprentice. And this would bring different schemes together in terms of the funding agency, as well as DWP and others. And I think that's a really important piece of work that was done there, which was then further developed when the DFE commissioned in 2018, Emily Jones and Elizabeth Davis and the winning LWI. And they were basically exploring whether the current levels of funding and support for apprentices with additional learning needs, additional support needs, were sufficient, and what sort of barriers and what sort of obstacles there were in the way of both providers and employers, and then some practical help and support to overcome some of those barriers that was consistent with the rules and the guidelines that was laid down for additional funding. And I think what was critical from that, and I will cover a little bit of this in some of the things that we'll do later on, is that there were real problems about the complexity of learning support and how it was difficult for providers, particularly those providers that didn't have, for example, a large learning support function or an additional learning support team, such as in a college or a large training provider, local authority. But those providers often working with apprentices were smaller, had less of that sort of infrastructure support. How often they found it very confusing in terms of all the guidance, the compliance with the guidance, the audit requirements, the reporting requirements, etc. And I think that range of, if you want, factors sometimes made it such that the learning support wasn't being claimed, the funding certainly wasn't being claimed, and that meant that, of course, apprentices weren't able either to start the programs, certainly to be retained on the program and complete them. So I think these provide, if you want, very useful backgrounds to what we're going to be looking at today. I think it's important, therefore, that in your organisation, whatever size you are, whatever your backgrounds are, that there is some kind of clarity around a learning support strategy, which extends beyond your full-time learners or adult learners or loan-funded learners to include all learners, and particularly here, apprentices. And I think that's very important because there is a research that shows that the learning need or disability of apprentices doesn't match what might be said of the general population. And therefore, this raises two questions. Are the participation rates of apprentices with learning difficulties and or disabilities at the same level as the general population? The answer is no. And obviously, if they're not at the same level, then what's the issue? Is it because of a lack of understanding on the part of the learner, the partner, provider, or the employer. And even if learners do recognize that they have a need, is there a problem of concern about disclosing that need in terms of things like what it might mean to the job prospects or whatever? So I think it's important that we recognize, and this is very much the work that's been done in the last few years, when we talk to not only the providers, but the individual apprentices themselves, that they don't always feel safe or informed enough to declare that they have an individual need. And I think also, because of the complexity of learning support and the learning support funding and the way you claim it, there's not always that awareness of the range of individual needs that can be met by learning support funding. So I think we need to have a clarity around this. And my start point always, if you're a larger provider with, for example, a well-established learning support function that works for your 16 to 18 full-time and adults, is could you say the same of the support that you provide to apprentices, particularly apprentices that might not actually come into you physically as a training provider, where all the off-the-job training is done either at the employer's premises or online. And I think COVID has added a new dimension to this. And I know one or two of you already said, do you think this has been exacerbated by COVID? Certainly it has. And that's also meant that we've had to be rather more agile and flexible in the way in which we think about learning support. And as I shared with colleagues earlier, it isn't about always identifying the individual and their individual needs to be able to complete the learning that's in the apprenticeship program. It's at the beginning, during induction, before they onboard, before they start the program. But what about that large number of learners that during COVID might have experienced a whole set of other barriers, obstacles, emotional, social issues, mental health issues that now require your support by you claiming learning support funding so that they can complete their apprenticeship program. So it is much more of it isn't always done at the start. It's not always about initial and diagnostic assessment during the induction. It can be, of course, a need. And I'll give you a classic example. Way about 10 years ago, when I was more active still working in a provider, one of our apprentices, had a serious motor accident and broke their back. Now, to complete their apprenticeship, which of course their employer facilitated by making the necessary adjustments in the workplace, we also had to make a lot of adjustments to the learning program. And of course, that was not identified at the beginning of that apprentices program, but obviously after that change in that person's life and situation. So I think it's important that your learning support strategy extends to all of your learners. And if you're only providing apprentices, that you know that this covers a whole range of individual needs that we'll be looking at today. I think the other dimension that's very important is that learning support is an investment. When you get your learning support funding right, it helps a whole lot of learners with individual learning needs, and particularly some of those that might be hidden, right? Because without that, you wouldn't have had their engagement in the program. In some cases, they wouldn't even started the apprenticeship program, but also you avoid the risk of them dropping out and not completing or not being able to achieve. So I think it's important to recognize that any investment that you make will have a return. It either improves the initial recruitment, or it certainly improves retention. And of course, it will improve completion and achievement of apprenticeship programs. The other advantage, obviously, is that it will then possibly allow that learner to then progress to the next level of apprenticeship, depending on the job outcomes or the job situation, and to take on further learning as well. So I think that's a very important aspect of it. And this is recognized in the way that it helps to improve achievement rates. It helps the learners to stay on track, and obviously it will help with timely achievements and completion. So the learning support funding, LSF as we call it, or additional learning support funding, helps to offer the appropriate and targeted support to that individual learner. And I will stress, by the way, there is no one size fits all for learning support. Each individual learner, each individual apprentice will have their own individual needs. And that's recognized not only in terms of meeting the needs of the apprentice, but also meeting your legal duty under the Equality Act of 2010, as well as obviously now picking up what's in the revised inspection framework, the education inspection framework, and the increased focus that there is on meeting the needs of individuals with special education needs and or disabilities. And you can see that in the updated version of the Ofsted handbook. But also, I think you're supporting learners with individual needs, particularly apprentices, demonstrates not only the intent to provide a high quality of education to all your learners, but obviously that it has the implementation is there, as well as the impact as well. So, there's the quote: evidence will include the extent to which the provider staff engage with employers, because remember, the engagement's got to be with the employer and the individual apprentice. And this is obviously critical when you look at the commitment statement. And if you're ever short of knowing what to put in a commitment statement, the SFA provides you with some very useful templates. It's usually, I think, line 11, where you describe the learning support needs and the plan and the way you're going to deliver that support for that individual apprentice. So this brings in the apprentice, the provider, and the employer. And underpinning this, obviously, is the various stages which Carol will pick up later on in terms of the evidence. That's the initial assessment, the diagnostic assessment, then the provision of support, the ongoing assessments and reviews, as well as the milestones throughout the programme. And then any additional qualifications which might be included. For example, if the learner, rather than do a functional skill in maths at level 1, might need to do it at entry level, or in some cases, the learner might be doing ESOL in the place of, because you've got that identification of that start point for that learner, or British Sign Language, again, where it's more appropriate. But I think the key thing here is that it's the monitoring and support. It's the ongoing monitoring and support that gives those learners the confidence to stay on the programme, to gain the new knowledge, skills and behaviours that the standard requires, and achieve their full potential. So you can see that there's a funding advantage in it. It's also very important that you can see that the quality and the implications are there. And all of this, of course, is about the individual apprentice and them achieving their potential. But I think there are a lot of problems around this. And, if you look at particularly the 2018 report, and I think it's well worth downloading that and having a look at it, because it highlights, I think, what were issues in 2008, which I still think are issues. And I know I talked to a lot of independent training providers and private training providers, and we are one ourselves. We can see those things recurring in those providers: a lack of coherent policy and procedures for learning support for apprentices, poor identification assessment of needs, a lack of who's actually responsible. Is it the training provider's manager? Is it the training provider's assessor tutors? Is it the assessor? Is it the mentor? Who's responsible for that individual and their individual needs? There's a lack of awareness of the range of individual needs. It's often very much down at the level, or at that, sorry, not down at that level, but the level of identifying dyslexia or dyspraxia, or a hearing impairment, a sight impairment. But there are much more complex combinations: emotional, social, mental health issues, moderate learning difficulties, and in some cases, obviously, quite significant learning difficulties. But even when they've been identified, and that's great when the provider gets all of that right, but then the support isn't provided, the plan isn't delivered, or it's not a high quality of support. So there's two issues there. And then there's no reporting, or there's no tracking, or there's no monitoring of the actual support. So if you are then subject to an audit, and you've been claiming the £150 per month plus any excess learning support for any of your apprentices, and you haven't got evidence that it actually happened, you might have evidence that you planned it, but no evidence of actually happening, then obviously that makes it a significant issue, which, if it takes you over a certain percentage of your learners, could possibly lead to a much more detailed audit and qualification. There's also another issue, which I think I've picked up, even with colleges, and sometimes there's actually a relatively low level of funding claim when you look at the percentage of apprentices that you claim learning support for compared to the general population, or the rest of your learners. And I was talking to a provider who had 150 apprentices, and only 2 of them, they had learning support. And yet when I looked at their full-time learners, of which they had 2,000, 16 to 18, about just over 10% of those they were claiming learning support for. So you can see that that's a real manifestation of some of the issues around learning support in apprenticeships. And the other thing to note is that sometimes providers don't focus on so what. As a result of identifying, planning, supporting that individual, what's been the impact and what were we expecting? And I tend to think of it as an investment. If I invest £1,000 in apprentices, in a single apprentice's learning support, I know I'm going to get that back in the fact that there will be more months that I've earned my on-program payments and a greater chance of earning the 20% completion payment. So you can see the return on investment, as well as the social benefits and the personal benefits to that apprentice. So, and by the way, when I mentioned the commitment statement template, the template can allow you in many ways to vary it to your own circumstances. So you don't necessarily have to follow the one that is on the ESFA website. So what sort of processes, what sort of things do we need to make sure we've got in place to define and identify learning support needs? And I'm going to start with perhaps one that's a bit more of an issue now, and it's maybe not being given as much attention. That's mental health. It's a growing area of concern for a lot of us as providers. It can straddle both the learning support and, remember, what we used to call additional learning needs and additional social needs, as well as social and safeguarding needs. Now, you can't always meet that need from the individual learner through learning support by yourself. You might have to have referrals to other agencies, and of course those costs can be identified and claimed. But I think it's important because those of you maybe who are not management information people, it might be worth asking your management information systems manager, you know, when an individual apprentice goes on to the individualized learner record and we identify their LLDD and health problem, which you have to, and you have to usually identify what the main one is, or whatever the range is. Sometimes it's not recognized that mental health difficulty, which is I think code 9, is actually one that you can actually identify and recognize and say that will require support in the form of a counselor or any other means that you think will mean that person is able to stay in the program and complete the program. I know one of you asked me about social and emotional difficulties. That's, by the way, actually is code 8. So, you know, that there is a range of things that we can include, and these are disclosed either by the learner or found by you in discussion with the learner, or with the learner and their employer or the advocate or the sponsor, whatever. But it's a whole range of things, and it can include, for example, temporary disability after an illness, for example, post-COVID, or after an accident, or it can be other medical conditions such as epilepsy, asthma, diabetes. So, you know, try and think of that broader range, but mental health is one I think that we've got to be looking at. In terms of learning support, a diagnosed, well understood already, in some cases, the learner might be coming to you with an education health care plan, or if they were older, they might have had a learning difficulty assessment. It could be an undiagnosed learning difficulty and or disability, which only occurs when it becomes clear in your interactions with that learner. And then, of course, it's identifying the appropriate learning support plan, and then the appropriate learning support funding to fund that plan to meet the requirements of the apprenticeship. Now, this is very important because it's about the learning requirement. Anything that's needed to be able to make adjustments in the workplace for the apprentice is not covered by this. That's covered by the DWP and access to work. So I think it's important to recognize this is about the learning aspects and the learning requirements of the apprenticeship. And of course, there's also that broader range of things, such as social or safeguarding support, which are covering what we call the personal, social, and other aspects. Sometimes this is covered by discretionary learner support, or what the employer might provide, or in any bursaries that are available. And of course, don't forget that young apprentices that have come out of care, that care leavers, there is a bursary of £1,000 available for them to cover the initial cost of looking after themselves and having their own finances to look after. So I think, we've got to identify quite a broad range, and some of these are much more to do with learning support, and others are much more to do with learner support, which of course is not necessarily the theme for today. So how do we go about doing this? And how do we identify and assess the individual support needs for any apprentice? And it's I think a staged process. It clearly starts with recruitment. In some cases, the person would declare that. Some cases, they bring an education healthcare plan. But it's very much about your initial assessment of things like functional skills, of their skills generally in relation to, say, engineering, construction, or whatever, and that wider range of activities that go on entry. But also in some cases in pre-entry, when the person actually applies for the apprenticeship and makes that disclosure to you at that stage. What I think is important is to recognize that, this will usually involve you having the right resources in place in the first place, so that that you know how to define the learning support, you know how to complete the the commitment statement, and obviously therefore have all the information you need for the evidence pack. But I think it also that the recruitment and the during apprenticeship phase must require to have the necessary infrastructure in place. Who's responsible for the initial and diagnostic assessment? Who's responsible for observing and monitoring the performance of the apprentice? And certainly in my models, it's always the person that has the most contact with them, which will be the workplace tutor, workplace assessor, coach, or mentor. But also to recognize anything that affects what's happening in the workplace, and that might require sourcing from a different source, such as DWP, or from the employer, to make sure that they make reasonable adjustments. And any learning difficulty which is identified, which makes it difficult to do the learning, obviously is covered by learning support, but to be able to do the tasks in the job is much more about access to work. And any additional employability support that means the person is work ready, that will be able to move from an apprenticeship into full employment, and or be able to move to a different employer if that's required as well, but also to remove any of those barriers that might mean that the apprentice is not kept on. And I think that during the apprenticeship will also mean making any adjustments that are required in assessing them on the job, assessing off the job, and obviously engagement with the endpoint assessment organisation to make sure that any adjustments that are required there are already planned for as well. So before the person goes through the gateway, are we sure that we've done everything to make those necessary adjustments? And then obviously through the endpoint assessment to make sure that the adjustments are made there. So I think that then extends to the completion of the program. And in some cases, don't forget, some learners will need additional support to complete their apprenticeship past their end date. And this can extend not only to English and maths, because that might not have been completed yet, but any other aspects of the program that they haven't been able to complete. And I think that obviously is very critical. And we know at the moment, we've got quite a lot of learners have been through endpoint assessment, but they haven't yet completed English and maths. There've been issues in their completion, and we had to provide some of them with additional learning support in either one or both of those areas. But I think the key thing here is understanding your role as the provider, but also making sure that the employer understands their role. And in particular, whoever in the employer is in direct contact with the apprentice, such as the workplace supervisor or the mentor, etc. One thing I would certainly add, that if all the way through these processes, and Carol will pick them up later on, we are making sure that all of our staff, that's the provider staff, are trained, but we also ensure that any of the employer staff that are involved in these relationships join the same training. We just think it's unfair to have our staff fully versed in all of the understanding of learning support, but not the employer's staff. And we think that's a critical thing. But one caveat that I've got to add at this stage is learning support must not be used to deal with everyday difficulties. I want to keep on emphasizing that. It appears in the guidance. It's also obviously in the compliance and regulations. It's, if an apprentice says, well, I'm not quite sure about this concept, can you give me another 3 or 4 minutes on that? that's an everyday problem. Pastoral care is built into this. The assumption that coaching and tutoring will be ongoing, that progress reviews will be, part of the funding. This is when, on top of that, an individual, which other learners might not need, another apprentice might not need, has another need that requires that additional time, additional cost, etc. So it's not the everyday difficulties, and that's something just to sort of remind you of. So it can take a whole lot of forms of support, from you, the one-to-one for functional skills, particularly if they're below the minimum entry level, paying for specialist assessment and support, so you can do that, use a package or whatever, contextualize English and maths so that you've got the range of opportunities to deliver that, more time in exams or endpoint assessment, using adaptive technologies, customizing materials to make sure that people with dyslexia are not disadvantaged or whatever, supporting adaptations to the workplace processes and systems, again, but using, obviously, access to work, particular help for those with sensory communication needs. All of these things are aspects of and are eligible to be funded, offering buddy systems for one-to-one, where the council, you might be offering a much more intensive form of support for some apprentices who are lacking confidence, etc. And any reasonable adjustments for endpoint assessment. So all of those are eligible. But also understand that when it comes to social and safeguarding needs, we often have to get the combination of support, usually one-to-one, from both the employer, so the employer's line managers or their HR team. So those ones in orange are our employer partners, and they're mentoring, coaching, reassuring, developing the emotional resilience of the apprentice, and alongside our tutors, our assessors, and our ALS support staff. That support for social safeguarding, I said, could be mentoring, buddy systems. For example, I've seen that work well in a couple of our partners. Providing counselling. Can I just say, counselling is not be to confuse with the sort of pastoral care that's built in to your core funding for an apprentice. This is on top of that, where you might be a referral to one of your professional counsellors for those individual needs. Support access, where there's specific financial support. Again, that's not learning support, but much more to do with learner support or using the bursary. And then obviously flexible, shift patterns, appointments for those that might have those caring responsibilities or chaotic personal lives. We think it's very important to extend the support for employability skills, money, advice, etc., equipment for training and learning. And by the way, if an individual needs an adaptation of equipment or specialist equipment, for example, specialist iPad, etc., can you make sure that you spread the costs of that iPad over the number of years that you normally depreciate your capital IT equipment? I've seen, an apprentice on a 39-month engineering apprenticeship where the cost of the iPad was fully borne in the first year, even though the learner was using it over the 3 years. So, otherwise that would be a disproportionately large claim in the first year. Well, and again, if you have to buy in specialist support where the skills are not available in your own organisation, there you would have invoices. So if you're having to use, say, a counselling service or the local authority provides you with dyslexia assessment, then you would have an invoice to pay there. So these are all eligible costs, as well as any adjustments that have to be made at endpoint assessment. And this is critical, by the way. It is part of the individual learning support plan that includes endpoint assessment. If it doesn't, then it's not a very good plan. It seems sometimes, or the vice versa. I've seen all the support being put into endpoint assessment and then ask an obvious question. What about the on-program support? Did the learner not need that for the 2 years before they got to endpoint assessment? Oh, yeah, didn't know about that. We just thought about what we needed to do in terms of location, timing, wording, the form of equipment, any adaptive software, or any additional time that the person needed if there was a written element at it. But I think what's critical here is understanding that it's all those stages where the learning support can be provided for that individual learner. And that, to me, is important because endpoint assessment should mirror all the adjustments and additional support that we've been providing while they're on the actual program. So, I think that's a key point to note. In terms of the funding, well, I think most of you will be aware that the ESFA in England supports individual apprentices at through the learning support funding at the rate of £150 per month, which you can claim through the ILR. So if you know that you're providing the support for the learner all the way through their apprenticeship program, then you can claim that every month. If you're doing it when they come into you for their block release or day release, you can claim it for those periods. The important thing is it's paid to you by the ESFA. It is not part of the price that you negotiate with the individual employer for that individual apprenticeship standard. So it is paid to you directly. So obviously you've got to make sure you've got all the evidence there that's contained inside the ILR that you would have obviously in the commitment statement. And then if I ever asked to look, I would always ask for the evidence pack to show me how you've assessed that individual. Is it in the plan? Is it, and how is it described in the commitment statement, as well as how did you report it in the ILR? If you ever need more than £150 in a month, the 150 is just simply what we're assuming over the average length of an apprenticeship program the learner needs each month to cover their learning support cost. So it's not a calculation that's based on what we do know is currently the case. It's what we did, it's how we set up and how the whole of learning support funding was set up for adults and apprentices several years back. So therefore, if a learner needs more than £150 in a month and you've got evidence of it, i.e. invoices, timesheets or whatever, then you can claim that thing, which is known as excess learning support, through the earnings adjustment statement. And that will be basically to cover any costs for learning support up to £19,000 per annum for any individual apprentice. This is per individual apprentice. Should you need more than £19,000 for an individual apprentice, thank you, right, then you make what we call exceptional learning support, but that's learning support, and that's got to come from the ESFA in addition to any allocation that you've already been given. It's usually useful if you know that that learner's coming before they start the apprenticeship to flag this up and say, this learner needs more than £19,000. I've only had one apprentice in all my life that needed more than £19,000. If, by the way, that apprentice is in the 19 to 24 age group, you have to make sure that if they haven't got an education healthcare plan, that you find out why they haven't got one. And if the local authority has not been willing to issue an education healthcare plan for that learner's 19 to 24, get that confirmed in writing. And therefore, you can then show that and demonstrate it to the ESFA and any auditor that comes along. And any learner that's aged 19 to 24 that does have an education healthcare plan or has been in the care of a local authority, so it includes care leavers, currently the ESFA will pay £1,000 incentive payment to the employer. That's in two payments, 500, that's one after 90 days and one after 365 days, and also £1,000 to you as the provider, and again in two instalments. And I think that recognises that age group with education healthcare plans often has those additional aspects that require some additional support, etc. But that additional support funding, that is additional support payment, is actually to cover the cost of administration, recruitment, personal equipment, etc. And obviously the learning support funding would be on top of that. And this isn't in place of, by the way, it's on top of. And there are other sources of funding, specific provider hardship funds. You might have a sponsored hardship fund for apprentices that might help them. You can use support agency support. You can use Access to Work, which is DWP, or you might be using as I said, the £1,000 care leavers bursary, which again is paid to you, and then you can pass that on to the care leaver apprentice. So the funding is there, right? My feeling is that, and I think we agree, that generally there's an underclaim on that funding. How you earn it, well, this is how you earn it. Basically, I've got a 22-year-old, be the youngest apprentice ever, 22-year-old apprentice in a 13-month level 2 apprenticeship. We're providing the support and claiming it at £150 a month. In the first 2 months, block release, 6 and 7, block release when they come in, 12 and 13, the block release and their endpoint assessment. But the actual cost each time of each month, which is recognised, we've got evidence of, that's the key thing, is different each month. And therefore, we can only claim the 6 months of £150, that's £900, but we've got an actual cost of £14.50. So our excess learning support, which we claim through the earnings adjustment statement, now you can make that claim every 3 months, every 6 months at the end of the year. But the key thing here is, overall, we've got to have a feel that the excess learning support is for real cost above what the ILR has generated. And I think that's a very important point to just recognise. And I think the only other thing to note is that if you go into the guidance notes, the 2020-21 apprenticeship version 6 notes, all of this is contained in those guidance notes, including about the not dealing with everyday difficulties. And if an apprentice needs help at work, they're able to get help from Access to Work. But I think there's an important phrase here in the second para. This includes individuals who self-declare a learning difficulty and/or disability, and those who have not a diagnosis of a learning difficulty disability, but in relation to whom the main provider, and by the way, if you've got a subcontractor that delivers all or part of an apprenticeship, should only be part of an apprenticeship, you're still responsible for the learning support for that apprentice. So, and that has got to be identified through the ILR. So this is very important. It's about learning. When you've recognized that the learner, the apprentice, will not be able to meet the learning requirements of the apprenticeship, even though that wasn't a self-declaration or a diagnosis, then you can make that claim. And I think that's a very important thing. But you've got to go through these different stages, which Carol will pick up in a minute with you. So what are the practicalities, Carol?
It'd help if I unmuted my mic, wouldn't it? So thank you, Beej. So the practicalities in terms of apprenticeships in additional learning support is to just remember and be mindful that the learner support is fully funded in exactly the same way as an English and maths is fully funded. So the employer doesn't contribute at all. So in terms of their employer's digital account, whether a levy payer or a co-funded employer, then no monies are taken out their digital account. It's funded by the SFA. If you've negotiated a maximum funding rate to the cap value, then the monies for learning support is over and above that. So if you've got, say, a £5,000 business administrator apprentice, then you would get learning support monies over and above that £5,000. However, it's also important to just remember that the learner support hours do count towards their 20% off the job training. So every time you do learner support, that can come off that 20%. If you have an apprentice that only does their apprenticeship learning partway through the month, so for example with a break in learning, and so you don't actually trigger the £150 that month, but you have given learner support, you can claim that through the excess learning support in the earning adjustment statement. So in terms of the evidence required, the funding guidance is quite clear on what evidence is required. And I noted there was a question around the template for learner support. The SFA gives a template for the commitment statement, but not for actual learning support as such. But if you look at the evidence required, you'll be able to see very clearly what you need to include in that template. So the first thing obviously you do is you do your assessment of need and keep evidence of that, and then how you're going to meet that identified need. And the other thing you need to put in there is confirmation that the apprentice needs that learning support to be able to complete their apprenticeship within that. Once you've done your assessment, you can do your planning on how you're going to support the need, and then obviously actually do your delivery. So where Beej showed you the £150 a month, if you can only claim that £150 in the months where you've got evidence for learning support. So if you're going to do it every month and your costs are around that a month, then you can claim your £150. But if you're only doing it month 1, 3 and 5, only claim for month 1, 3 and 5. When you're doing your progress reviews with your learner to see if they're meeting the plan, then you'll adapt your plans as you go along, because things will change obviously with their apprenticeship as they're going. So again, keep the notes on what's changed, how you're adapting your delivery plan, and how you're then changing your delivery to meet the need. And then keep details as well of the outcome, so, and the impact on the attainment gap. So what I mean by that is, from the initial assessment, what's the value added in terms of then your, whether they got a pass, a distinction or a merit, whether they finished timely. And that will help you with then understanding how well your learner support is supporting the learners through, and also your conversations with Ofsted. And it's really nice. And in some cases, what you will see is actually those with a learning difficulty will probably attain better than those without, if you've got really good structured systems in place. If you are using exceptional learning support, so that over 19,000, you must keep a copy of your application, which you made to the SFA, and also the supporting evidence claim as well. The auditors will want to see that. So when we look at improving apprenticeship retention and achievement in terms of looking at the organisation, as Beej said earlier, really your learning support assessor or skills coach, mentor, whatever you call them in your organisation, will be the one that delivers the bulk of the learning support, because they're the one that will be seeing them in the workplace, in your training provider premises, with the help and support of a dedicated learning support team. So just think about making sure you've got clear lines of responsibility for that assessment of support need and referral. And that may change depending on where you are on the journey when that assessment is identified. So for example, if there's a declared LDD at the beginning on the enrolment form, you may refer them to somebody in the learning support team. But later down the line, if the employer flags that there's a social need, or you notice there's a need in terms of mental health, it may be the assessor that deals with that. The earlier you do your initial assessment and diagnostic, the better the outcome for the apprentice, and the more support they'll have to achieve timely. So in terms of your functional skills, most people do BKSB or another form of initial assessment to identify if additional maths and English are required. But you can also do things like a gap analysis as well to identify early those undisclosed needs. And you can use tools like Cognisys or QuickScan to do those for you. To look at the social needs, if you have a really good interviewing process, a good rigorous discussion with the learner at the beginning, you should be able to tease out if there's any social or behavioural needs that are going to need additional support to help them sustain their job and actually stay within the role to finish their apprenticeship. I think it goes without saying, the assessors and the skills coaches have an extremely diverse job role these days now, with all the different parts they do. The more simple the process for them to be able to apply, the easier it is going to be for them to spend their time supporting the apprentice. And then also the recording of that information, if it's embedded into their current practices, then again, it will help them, and you'll have a cohesive learning journey for your apprentice. Thank you, Beej. I think you were just then going to have a quick discussion around the summarising of the quality aspects.
Yeah, I was just, I think at this point, because it's absolutely opportune, I think, Carol, that we hand over to Holly, because she can give us an overview of how e-spirals can be used to record additional learning support for apprentices, so you can prepare the claim, prepare for audit, and prepare for Ofsted. So before I just do the concluding comments, Holly, over to you, and we'll share the screen.
Great, thanks, Beej. I'm going to share. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Great. What I'm going to do is a really quick overview. We haven't got a great deal of time left, so if you'd want to book a more detailed demonstration and a full conversation around how it could work for you as a provider, then please do get in touch. My details are at the end. But I wanted to show you eSpirals. It's fully customizable, so it allows you to record all the different types of support that Beej and Carol have talked about. So everything from the one-to-one support, the extra time for EPA, and the adaptive technologies. It can also help you identify apprentices that need support, so pulling them through from your main system because of criteria such as passing their end date, or, as we talked about, having a diagnosed need. And what I've got open here first is the mobile module. So eSpirals is broken down into a core module and a mobile module. The mobile module is designed for staff who are mobile. So for when staff are with the employer or, you know, at different sites with the provider. It can also be used by external agency staff. So if you don't employ a counsellor, but you buy in that service, then they can use this as well to record the notes. And when a member of staff logs in, they see their kind of timetable of support. So they can click on an individual session. And what they record here is their attendance and the attendance of the learner, which is the bit that actually generates a cost, because obviously that support that you're putting in place has a cost implication. But what they've also got specifically for the additional support that's being put in place is the ability to record notes, to set targets for the learning support aspect as well. And they can see a summary of information about this individual that's brought through from the core module. And I just want to show you quickly an example of where this can be used for group support. So if we look at our functional skills tutor rows, we can see here that where we've got a group all receiving support for their early years for maths. If I go through to the record of work, you can see that we've got different individuals here, the different apprentices, and they can write notes about them individually, but also as a group. I'm going to show you a report a little bit later and talk about how obviously there's lots of information recorded in your e-portfolio systems, but how you can actually get this data that's for the additional support, so capturing all of that, how we can get that out of eSpirals, and then it can be shared further from there. But I'd like to take you into the core module and show you a little bit about a learner record. So the core module is where all the management and the setup of information goes. So if we take our individual Gemma first, we've got a page of information about her. A lot of this can be imported from your main college systems, or your main information systems rather, so you don't have to manually type everything in, but you start to build up a picture of Gemma in terms of the learning support that you're going to put in place. You can import the enrolment, you can record the employer. And as you start to build up the support and the cost implication, it pulls through here the total amount of money. It's showing as a negative because there isn't a budget as such. Obviously, it's just claimed back, so that's why that shows there as a negative. But I'll just scroll down a little bit. We've also got the ILR, the LLDD and health problem bits that Beej was talking about earlier in those values. So yeah, we start to get that whole picture of learning support. And in terms of Gemma then, so Gemma had an assessment carried out. I'll just close that because we've looked at her record. So when this additional support is put in place, when an assessment is carried out, all of this has a cost implication. So that's kind of part, almost like a byproduct of recording this support and these notes, in this case by a specialist support tutor, and that's what generates the cost. So once the assessment takes place, you then put the support plan. So we've got support programs here, one for coaching, the additional English support that Gemma needs to achieve her level 2. Gemma doesn't need exam arrangements or equipment loans, but we've also got the opportunity to record the ALS aspect of the reviews. So in addition to the apprenticeship reviews, reviewing the learning support at the kind of 8-week stages allows you to make sure, as Carol mentioned, that whether it needs adapting, whether it can just continue as it is. The reviews can also be done through the mobile module. So when staff are out and about, you can use it on mobile phones. Where's Gemma gone? Tablets and things, and it just makes it easier to record the information in that way. Although, as I'm showing here, it can also be viewed on a laptop. So that's the support plan that we've put in place for Gemma. I'm kind of whizzing through this because I know lots of people have just booked the hour for this webinar. So I'm going to just show you James quickly. James here has got an EHCP. So with James, when we record his EHCP, we can also, we can also upload a copy of the EHCP so that everything's secured, stored securely in here, and it can be viewed. So everything's together. So if Ofsted come and they want to have a look at an individual and they take James as an example, all the information that you need about him is stored in here. So James again also had an assessment carried out. He's got some exam arrangements in place for his extra time in his endpoint assessment. Just have a quick look. Don't think James has got an equipment loan, but if I have a look at all of the apprentices that I got together for the demo, you can see that if you're loaning out laptops for the portfolio work, our miscellaneous is a kind of catch-all for everything else. So we talked about the materials for dyslexia, or perhaps large print materials. Any welfare or counselling that you're putting through that you're not going through the mobile module, that can go through as a miscellaneous as well. Now, what I want to talk to you about is filtering. So one of the things that eSpirals is really useful for is finding learners that meet a particular criteria. So you're recording all this information about their learning support, and now you can see, you know, we've put this in place, who's achieved overall or who's achieved timely. Have we got any apprentices who have withdrawn? You know, can we look at the retention rates? You can also use filters because, as I mentioned before, you can import learners because they meet particular criteria, and then you need to carry out an assessment to find out, you know, what it is that you need to support. So this becomes a kind of to-do list, who's been imported as an apprentice, but we haven't actually carried out that initial assessment yet. Moving on to reporting. Oh, actually, let me just quickly show you the live cost browser. So this is where all of the costs are built up. I'll just show you one individual for now to make it a bit more straightforward. But this is really clear for audit. So you can see the trail of all the support that's been put in place, how that's built up in terms of the cost records. And you can look into these records in more detail as well. So that everything's there, should, you know, the auditors come knocking, and should Ofsted want to see the details of an individual. eSpirals has been developed to make it really easy to report on all of the data that you can see. So anywhere in the system you can export this and therefore share it with other systems as well. But we've also got our tools like the exporter. So within the exporter you can look at things like a list of your employers. If I just find my group of apprentices, and I'll have a look at them. Obviously this is only kind of the tip of the iceberg, but yeah, you can get your lists of apprentices that meet particular criteria. So you have a look at who you want to see, looking at those, as I showed you before, that have achieved timely, looking at the detail of support for them, and being able to assess that even further. And then we've got our pre-designed report. So we've got the earnings adjustment statement in here. I'm just going to change the date range to the academic years, because obviously working with the ILR, you need to be working in the academic years. I'll just reload that page. So eSpirals allows you to set your own date range definitions. You can look at your January starts, whether they're on an 18-month apprenticeship or a 12-month apprenticeship. So you've got the full picture of the support that you've put in place. But obviously in terms of something like the ILR return, where we're talking about the academic years, we can change the date range for that as well. And I'm just going to pull through again my sample apprentices here. And this, oh, let me click the button, that would help. This shows us the number of months that they've got the 150, and then anything over and above that. It will also identify to us if anybody is actually significantly under the £150 per month, and you can look at whether actually that should have been spread out, or so that you don't have to claim every month. And it pulls through the earnings adjustment value for you there. So that's all built into eSpirals.
Can I just add, by the way, Holly, can I just say that point you've just made about the earnings adjustment statement is absolutely very, very vital. If you've got evidence that on the ILR that you've claimed that month, it's well below 150, you should balance that out with any months above 150 before you make the claim. I think that's a very good point you've raised there.
Great, thanks, Beej. And the other thing that I wanted to show you, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the e-portfolios and where most of your information about your apprentices will be held, the record of work is what we call the notes that we record in eSpirals Mobile. And if I just pull this up for an individual, I think we're looking at the right dates here. So this is the kind of data you can then export so that can be shared. That didn't help, did it? Should I have gone back to yesterday, perhaps? I think, yeah, so this can be then shared with other systems so that you've got the notes that have been written about that additional support. You've got, you know, the member of staff and the attendance values and things. So obviously eSpirals is all about that, the over and above, the additional support, and then allowing you to not only ensure that the money is claimed, but also allowing you to look at statistics, as I said before, in terms of achievement and retention. And having that data in eSpirals will allow you to do those comparisons of, like Carol was saying, the achievement of those who have been supported against your kind of general cohort of those that haven't. Let me just double check there wasn't any. Oh, I did actually want to show you one other export that we've got here, which is about destinations. So we can look at the destination and progression. So this is in terms of the ILR value. So again, it allows you to look at your supported learners and where they've moved on to after their apprenticeship. So as I said, that's a real whistle-stop tour. I've talked very quickly and I hope you've all managed to keep up. But as I said, if you want to get in touch to book a full presentation, I was on the different slide earlier, we've got the details up here. I hope you can still see that now. With our website and email address, but my email address as well, and I can arrange to do a full demonstration, and as I said, also a discussion about how we can help you work with it as a provider. We like to work on that kind of individual level and talk to you about how you can make the system work for you. So
well, that's great, Holly. Thanks very much for that whistle top bit, but I think it's just helpful that you've linked it back to what we've been saying about how the system allows you to get that clear sense of how you recorded all that additional learning support from the point of view of being able to maximize your claim, absolutely critical, provide the evidence for audit, absolutely critical, and of course provide the evidence for Ofsted. So really good. Those three things have got to be, I think, emphasized all the time. So thanks very much for that quick demonstration. Thank you. I'm now going to go back to the just to finish off the presentation. And I've just got a minute or so. Let me just do that. Come to the slide. So Carol looked at the sort of improving apprenticeship retention achievement from that point of view of the individual learner. A couple of things, Jen, just to add. I think it's important that you do make effective use of the other tools that you've got, such as ePortfolio, whatever you've got, that you record the types of support, the duration and progress, as well as obviously in that record everything that you've done that helps the individual learner. And Holly showed us, for example, where there was individual support for learners with English and maths on a one-to-one basis, or additional workshops, etc. Remember, it's always the additional. The learners are already getting their functional skills, English and maths. This is what you're offering on top or in a different format, as well as, of course, incentivizing the people who will be the front line of identifying and supporting a lot of your apprentices. That's your, what do you call it, workplace tutors or assessors. And I'll give you a good example. If we've got learners out, you know, in engineering construction, have got individual needs, our workplace tutors will have a reduced caseload to reflect the additional time they're spending with those individual learners. And I think it's a real demonstration to the staff that they understand this takes longer. You might be out visiting them, instead of taking 1.5 hours, it might be 3 hours because the additional time you spend with them. I think the key thing I've said before is good quality training in all aspects of this that we've talked about, not only for our assessors, workplace tutors, but also the employer's contacts. And that, as I said, that close liaison with specialist staff internally. So if the workplace tutors bring back information about an individual learner, how does that information get its way to the institution's ALS team, who might be able to then provide the referral? The referral will be for additional support, or in some cases externally. And I think also to recognize that for an apprenticeship, there are some very good programs such as trainees, supported internships, I know what some of you are offering, which allow us to build up a picture of the individual before they become an apprentice. And that's that building of the relationship, that understanding the needs of that learner, as well as all of the other things we talked about, such as different delivery platforms that certainly over COVID have been very, very helpful. I think working with the specialist agencies, I know one of you has asked about support for learners with mental health issues that have not been diagnosed, but the learner is clearly struggling with the progress in learning. And I think that's, again, identified and you then will put on whatever support you think you need for that learner for as long as you need and at whatever cost you need. But I think it's about having a genuine discussion with that learner about what the impact is on their learning and their ability to complete the program. And I know that Carol, you said something similar, as well as extending programs. Why do you make every apprenticeship program the same length when some learners clearly need more months? Now that reduces, I know, your own program earnings, but it also means you've got more months in which you can claim the learning support if you're providing it, as well as all the other things we talked about there. And I think that's why using the software to reflect the journey of the individual learner and the different stages is so critical. And I think sometimes it's good just to share good case studies and examples of how you've used any of these tools and how you've supported individual learners. And particularly, you know, Carol mentioned some of the tools that you can use for identifying English and maths, Cognisys for digital cognitive assessment, which can identify cognitive learning difficulties. We've certainly been and learning needs, as well as recognizing, by the way, all the things that the apprentices can do. So it's that multifaceted side of the apprentice and what they bring to their apprenticeship program. So are there any more questions or comments that we've not picked up, Marek? We've just got a couple of... Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you. I know some of you have now got to leave. It's just 5 minutes after. Contact details, they're available as Holly showed. So if you want to get in touch with us, there's my details, Holly's details, Carol's details, as well as obviously any information you want in terms of a demonstration from Holly and the team of how eSpirals can do all those things to facilitate the optimization of learning support for apprentices. Marek, are there any other questions or comments that we maybe have missed in the course of today?
No, I think we've covered everything, but obviously if you feel there's anything that we've missed, or upon reflection or review of the video recording, and this goes for anyone who is just watching this on the video recording, if you've got any questions, there are the contact details, and please do feel free to get in touch with any questions or thoughts.
Marek, I know that quite a few people that signed up are actually eSpirals users already, and if they wanted to look at it in terms of specifically for apprenticeships, I'm also very happy to, you know, to speak to them. And if there are other teams within colleges that already use it that want to see it, then yeah, we're always here to help.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that, Holly. Thanks again, Carol, for helping prepare today and for also your inputs. Carol, anything else you want to add?
No, I think everything's been covered. Thank you very much, Beej. But I'd like to thank both you and Holly for all the work you've put in today on it.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's appreciated. Thank you for that. And again, you know, if you've got any other things that you might want us to cover in future, e-memoir's happy and very happy to work with eSpirals. And we've already done something on improving the starting on apprenticeships with Carol. If there's anything else you think we should be looking at, then get in touch with either ourselves or Carol and Holly at eSpirals. Okay, then.